Welcome to the neighborhood war. When I bought my modest home on Chestnut Drive, I thought I was finally stepping into the peaceful life I had worked so hard for. The house was nothing extravagant. A single-story ranch with a yard big enough for summer barbecues and a garden I was eager to try my hand at. The neighborhood was advertised as a quiet community where neighbors become family. That should have been my first clue. I moved in on a sunny Saturday morning, my little U-Haul trailer stuffed with boxes, an old couch, and my recliner. As I hauled the first box up the walkway, I saw her, Deborah Rinslow, my next-door neighbor. She stood on her front porch, a glass of lemonade in one hand and a clipboard in the other. Her eyes tracked my every step, narrowing as she examined my belongings, my clothes, even the color of my front door. I gave her a friendly wave. She didn't wave back. Instead, she turned to her clipboard and started writing. I brushed it off. Every neighborhood has that one person, right? The self-appointed watchdog, the retired hall monitor turned suburban sheriff. I had no idea that Deborah was about to make my life hell. The first week went smoothly enough. I was too busy unpacking to worry about the ominous glares from her porch. But I noticed something odd by day 3. My mailbox was leaning. At first, I figured it was just loose soil or a delivery truck brushing it too close. So I straightened it and moved on. 2 days later, the mailbox was leaning again, this time at an even sharper angle. I finally decided to inspect it. The wooden post was scratched, as though something had repeatedly struck it at the base. Now I've been around long enough to know the difference between natural wear and intentional damage. This was no accident. That's when I caught her, Deborah, in broad daylight, wearing gardening gloves, standing in my front yard with a rubber mallet. She was hammering my mailbox like it owed her money. I stepped outside, too stunned to even be angry. "Excuse me." She froze. Then, without missing a beat, she said, "Your mailbox is an eyesore. It doesn't match the neighborhood aesthetic." It was a plain black mailbox on a wooden post, identical to at least 5 others on the street. "It's a mailbox," I said. "Yes, and it's offensive." I had no idea how to respond to that. "Please don't touch my property again," I said, trying to keep the peace. She gave me a tight smile and went back to her porch, clipboard in hand. That was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, my mailbox became a battleground. Every few days, it would be damaged, knocked sideways, or covered in some strange substance. Grease, spray paint, even glitter once. It became clear that Deborah had made it her personal mission to eradicate my mailbox from existence. I replaced it 3 times in 2 months. Each time, I upgraded it slightly. A sturdier post, stronger materials. Each time, she escalated. One morning, I found tire tracks in my lawn, and my mailbox flattened like a pancake. I knew it was her, but knowing and proving are 2 very different things. So I installed cameras. Front, back, side yard, all angles covered. I expected her to be sneaky about it, maybe creep out at night in all black like a sitcom burglar. Nope. The first night after the cameras went up, she marched right across my lawn at 2:14 a.m., flashlight in hand, wearing a pastel bathrobe covered in dancing poodles. With all the grace of a wrecking ball, she planted 1 foot firmly on the ground, warmed up like a baseball pitcher, and kicked my mailbox with every ounce of strength her 50-something frame could muster. The mailbox barely budged. Deborah, however, didn't fare so well. She let out a scream, stumbled back, and fell flat on her rear, her flashlight rolling into the street. I watched the footage 5 times the next morning. It was better than anything on Netflix. At first, I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Surely, the pain and the humiliation of being caught on camera would deter her. Maybe she'd even apologize. I underestimated how deeply rooted her entitlement was. The next day, she left a formal complaint in my mailbox. Yes, the same mailbox she tried to destroy. The letter was written in perfect cursive on HOA letterhead, though I later found out Deborah had no official position in the HOA whatsoever. Dear resident, it has come to the attention of the community that your mailbox violates several aesthetic and safety guidelines. It is requested that you remove the current structure and replace it with an approved model no later than 7 days from the date of this notice. Failure to comply may result in further action. Respectfully, Deborah Rinslow, Community Standards Liaison, self-appointed. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my coffee. That was the moment I decided, if Deborah wanted a war over my mailbox, I was more than happy to give her one. The next weekend, I made some calls. I wasn't just going to replace the mailbox. No, I was going to reinvent it. If Deborah wanted something to obsess over, I'd give her a masterpiece. A mailbox so indestructible, so immovable, so outrageous that it would haunt her dreams. After a few hours of research, I found a fabricator willing to custom make a steel-reinforced mailbox post, welded to a concrete anchor that would go 4 feet into the ground. The mailbox itself would be military-grade aluminum, capable of withstanding up to 1,500 pounds of force. Overkill? Maybe. But at this point, it wasn't about the mailbox anymore. It was about standing up to the kind of entitled bully who had spent her life steamrolling anyone who didn't conform to her standards. The day of the installation, I made sure to set up a lawn chair and enjoy the show. Deborah peeked through her curtains, clipboard clutched in her bony hands, eyes narrowed to slits. The installers took hours, drilling into the earth, pouring concrete, securing the steel post with bolts the size of soda cans. It was a thing of beauty, a monument to stubbornness. When it was done, I stood there with my arms crossed, admiring my work. The new mailbox gleamed in the sun like some glorious middle finger. Deborah stood on her porch, trembling with rage. She didn't say a word, not yet, but I could see it in her eyes. The war was far from over. If she wanted to fight, she'd picked the wrong opponent. The Steel Sentinel and the Queen of Complaints. The first day my new steel-reinforced mailbox stood guard at the edge of my property. It shimmered proudly in the afternoon sun like a monument to unbreakable resolve. Neighbors slowed down as they drove past, some squinting to make sense of what they were seeing. A mailbox that looked like it belonged outside a military bunker rather than a suburban home. But no one said anything. After all, no one wanted to get on Deborah's radar. Deborah herself, however, was a different story. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, her ever-present clipboard tucked under one arm like it was her personal constitution. I saw her lips moving, her fingers tapping the clipboard in an erratic rhythm, her eyes narrowed into cold, beady slits. She had seen the installation. She had heard the industrial drills, the clang of steel, the growl of the concrete mixer. And for once, she had been powerless to stop it. That should have been the end of it. But of course, Deborah didn't know how to lose gracefully. The first attack came under the cover of darkness. It was 1:45 a.m. when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my front-facing camera. I was half asleep, but curiosity got the better of me. I opened the app, and there she was, Deborah, dressed in what I can only describe as a burglar chick ensemble. Black sweatpants, black hoodie, and to top it off, a black headband covering her frizzy silver curls. Her clipboard was still in hand, because why wouldn't it be? I watched, stunned, as she pulled a claw hammer from her oversized handbag and approached my mailbox like it was a feral animal that needed to be put down. She swung with all her might, the hammer clanging off the steel post with a deafening metallic th. The force of the impact reverberated up her arm, and she dropped the hammer with a shriek. I laughed so hard I nearly fell out of bed. Deborah stumbled back, shaking her hand and muttering curses that my camera's microphone barely caught. She stood there for a moment, glaring at the mailbox like it had personally insulted her ancestors. Then, with her free hand, she flipped the mailbox off. I kid you not, she gave my mailbox the finger. Then she limped back across the street, retrieved her hammer, and scurried home. The next morning, I decided it was time to take things up a notch. I printed a still frame from the camera footage. Deborah mid-swing, her mouth twisted in frustration, her hammer frozen in the air. I taped it to the front of the mailbox with a note. Deborah, the mailbox one. Retire your weapon. It was childish, it was petty, and it felt fantastic. That afternoon, Deborah stormed out of her house like a hurricane in orthopedic sneakers. She marched right up to the mailbox, snatched the photo off it, and tore it into pieces. Then she saw me, casually watering my lawn with a grin I couldn't suppress. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "Funny," I said. "I thought you were the one trespassing and committing vandalism." Her face turned a shade of red usually reserved for fire hydrants and emergency stop buttons. "This is not over," she hissed, jabbing her finger at me like she was casting a suburban hex. "I'll have this monstrosity removed if it's the last thing I do." "Good luck with that," I said, raising my coffee cup in a mock toast. That's when the paper trail assault began. Every day, sometimes twice a day, Deborah left formal complaints in my mailbox. They were all written on forged HOA letterhead, though any fool could see the letterhead was just something she printed off on her home printer, complete with a misspelled version of the HOA president's name. Some of my favorites included violation, unapproved use of military-grade materials in a residential zone, safety hazard, potential for reflection-related eye damage to passing drivers, neighborhood aesthetic infraction, structure resembles industrial waste bin. It was pure, unfiltered madness, and it was also, I'll admit, hilarious. I kept every single one in a Deborah file, a folder I intended to turn into either a scrapbook or a legal exhibit, depending on how far she pushed this. But Deborah's fury didn't stop at paperwork. She started spreading rumors. I caught wind of it when I ran into old Mr. Stanhope, the retired postal worker who lived 3 doors down. We were both at the mailbox cluster for the community when he leaned in and whispered, "Deborah says your mailbox is a safety hazard. Something about sharp edges and exposed metal. Said you nearly blinded her dog." I had to take a deep breath to avoid choking on my own laughter. "Mr. Stanhope," I said, "Deborah doesn't even have a dog." He blinked. "Huh. Well, that's what she told me." That's when I realized she wasn't just after my mailbox. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against me. But here's the thing about Chestnut Drive. People hated Deborah. She'd spent the last decade enforcing unwritten rules, gossiping at HOA meetings, and handing out passive-aggressive notes like they were party favors. When she started trying to rally support for a mandatory mailbox conformity policy, people didn't line up behind her. They avoided her. I found out from my neighbor, Lydia, a retired nurse with a mean poker face, that Deborah had cornered her at the mailbox one morning. "She started rambling about your weaponized mailbox," Lydia said, sipping her iced tea. "Said you were installing hostile infrastructure. Whatever that means." "What did you say?" I asked. Lydia smiled. I told her I thought it was beautiful, and then I walked away. Deborah's campaign to isolate me backfired spectacularly. Instead of turning the neighborhood against me, she united them against her. A few days later, I found a homemade award in my mailbox. It was a hand-drawn certificate, signed by at least 10 neighbors, officially declaring my mailbox Best Defensive Structure of Chestnut Drive. I hung it inside my front door. Deborah, however, didn't find it so amusing. That night, I got another motion alert. This time, Deborah wasn't alone. She brought reinforcements, her sister, Maureen, who lived a few blocks away, and from what I'd heard, had been banned from the local PTA for staging a coup over bake sale proceeds. Together, the Rinslow sisters stood in my yard, flashlights in hand, inspecting the mailbox like archaeologists uncovering a cursed tomb. "This is a crime," Deborah muttered. "Total crime," Maureen agreed. They poked at it, knocked on it, even tried to wedge a screwdriver under the base. When nothing budged, Deborah shrieked in frustration, and once again, kicked the mailbox. She immediately collapsed onto the lawn, clutching her foot. Maureen just stood there, looking horrified. I leaned out my window. "You okay there, ladies?" Deborah screamed something unintelligible, and Maureen dragged her back across the street. I couldn't stop laughing. The war was far from over, but I was winning. Karen evolution. When petty becomes personal. The morning after Deborah's dramatic lawn collapse, I stood in my driveway, coffee in hand, enjoying the cool breeze. My mailbox stood tall, unscathed, unmoved, and unbeaten. Meanwhile, across the street, Deborah's curtains twitched every 30 seconds, like she was trying to perfect the art of spying without actually being seen. Spoiler alert. She was terrible at it. It was quiet, but that tense kind of quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could feel it. Deborah was scheming. And when people like Deborah scheme, the results are never logical, ethical, or even remotely sane. She didn't disappoint. At precisely 10:17 am, a white utility van screeched to a halt in front of my house. Two men hopped out, both wearing neon vests and mismatched gloves. The universal sign of people who don't work for the actual city, but have been hired by someone with more money than sense. "Morning," I called from my porch. The older one, whose name tag simply read Roy, squinted at me. "We're here to remove the illegal structure." I nearly choked on my coffee. Illegal structure. Mailbox. He tapped a clipboard, looking vaguely confused. Lady across the street said it was condemned. I glanced across the street. Deborah was hovering behind her curtains, eyes just barely visible. She saw me looking, dropped to the floor like a busted cat burglar, and disappeared. Condemned by who? I asked, gesturing to my pristine, flawless mailbox. Roy scratched his neck, clearly not paid enough for this. "She said she was from the HOA. "She's not," I said. "And that mailbox, that's legally installed. Reinforced base, within property lines, fully compliant with county regulations." Roy's partner, a younger guy chewing a toothpick, gave me a lopsided grin. "So, we're not wrecking it." "No, you're not." "Sweet." The kid pocketed his gloves. "I hate digging." Roy sighed, muttered something about crazy suburbanites, and they climbed back into the van. The whole thing lasted 5 minutes, but it felt like a declaration of war. That afternoon, Deborah escalated. Not with hammers or fake work crews. No, she decided it was time for public propaganda. She created, and I am not making this up, a newsletter, printed on bright yellow paper and stuffed into every mailbox on the street. Except mine. The front page featured a grainy, zoomed-in photo of my mailbox, taken from what had to be her upstairs window. The headline screamed, "Neighborhood under siege. The mailbox MNAC." It was a manifesto in 6 paragraphs, detailing how my weaponized postal structure was not only a threat to community harmony, but also, somehow, a danger to children, pets, passing birds, and general peace of mind. My personal favorite part, the bit where she accused the mailbox of interfering with Wi-Fi signals. I only knew about the newsletter because Lydia from next door knocked on my door that evening, cackling so hard she could barely stand. "You've got to see this," Lydia said, waving the paper like a golden ticket. I read the whole thing twice, once in disbelief, and a second time for pure entertainment. Deborah had either lost her grip on reality, or this was some kind of Olympic-level commitment to petty vengeance. Either way, I wasn't tearing down my mailbox for anyone, especially not her. The neighborhood's response was immediate and glorious. By the next morning, half the houses on Chestnut Drive had created mailbox-themed decorations in solidarity. One house put a tiny plastic crown on their mailbox. Another built a mini fence around theirs with a "No KRENS ALOWED" sign. Lydia, always an overachiever, turned her mailbox into a full medieval castle, complete with paper turrets and a drawbridge. Deborah stormed from house to house, clutching her clipboard so hard her knuckles turned white. She demanded, shrieked, really, that the residents respect the sanctity of uniform aesthetics. Not a single person took her seriously. When she reached Lydia's house, Lydia simply stood on her porch, sipping her tea, and said, "It's art, Deborah. You hate art." Deborah spun on her heel, trembling with frustration, and stomped back across the street. That night, the real fireworks began. At exactly midnight, my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I was almost excited to see what Deborah had cooked up this time. I opened the app and there she was. But she wasn't alone. She brought a shovel. Dressed in full black, or as full black as her collection of yoga pants and bedazzled sweatshirts would allow. Deborah stood at the edge of my yard, shovel in hand, staring at my mailbox like a villain monologuing before the final battle. She raised the shovel high and, to my absolute delight, brought it down onto the steel post with both hands. The sound was incredible. A loud, echoing "Seedal-Ainhi" that surely woke up half the street. The shovel bounced back, vibrating violently in her grip, and she stumbled sideways, nearly falling over. She didn't quit. She tried again, and again, and again. 5 strikes in, her breath was ragged, and she was swearing so loudly my microphone actually had to muffle the feed. On the 6th swing, the handle snapped in half, leaving her holding the useless splintered stump. Defeated, she hurled the broken shovel into my azaleas and slumped down on the curb, muttering to herself like a suburban golem. I stepped outside, leaning against my doorframe. "Can I offer you a refreshment?" Deborah shrieked and bolted back across the street, barefoot, one sock left behind in her panicked retreat. The next morning, the sock was still there. I mounted it on the mailbox like a trophy. For the next week, Deborah went into full retreat mode. No more nighttime raids, no more fake utility vans, no more newsletters. But that didn't mean she gave up. Instead, she called the county inspector. Twice. Both times, I welcomed the inspector with a fresh cup of coffee and a binder full of permits, documentation, and photos of the installation process. Both times, the inspector walked away shaking his head, muttering something about these damn HOA tights. By the second visit, we were practically friends. Deborah's desperation grew. She sent anonymous letters to the HOA. Everyone knew they were from her, accusing me of mailbox extremism and suburban terrorism. She called the local news station, who laughed and hung up on her. And then, finally, she reached her breaking point. At 3 a.m. one Friday night, my cameras caught her standing in her front yard, screaming at my mailbox. Full volume, hands shaking, hair wild, every insult in the book, and some she clearly invented on the spot, hurled at an inanimate object. It was both disturbing and incredible. By Saturday morning, a petition was circulating, not to remove my mailbox, but to remove Deborah. After years of her antics, lawn fines, trash can placement lectures, and vendettas over garden gnomes, the neighborhood had finally had enough. The mailbox war had become the final straw. I sat on my porch that afternoon, drinking lemonade and watching as one neighbor after another signed the petition. Deborah, meanwhile, stared at me from her window, seething, powerless for the first time in years. And my mailbox. It stood there, glorious and unbreakable, a symbol of everything she couldn't control. From mailbox feud to suburban mutiny. By the time the petition to remove Deborah had gathered enough signatures to hold a formal hearing with the HOA board, it was no longer about my mailbox. It had become personal for everyone on Chestnut Drive. Deborah wasn't just the woman who hated my mailbox. She was the self-appointed enforcer of pointless rules, the queen of snide remarks at community cookouts, the woman who once issued a written complaint about the unapproved shade of green in someone's window box planters. She had been holding the entire neighborhood hostage under her rigid sense of order for years, and the mailbox war was the breaking point. But if anyone thought Deborah was going to go quietly, They didn't know Deborah. The preemptive strike. The morning the HOA board scheduled the emergency meeting, I expected Deborah to retaliate with another round of fake violation notices, or perhaps a safety alert flyer blaming my mailbox for causing migratory bird confusion. What I didn't expect was a full-on yard invasion. It started at dawn. I woke up to the sound of clanging metal and furious grunting. When I looked out my window, there was Deborah, in her infamous poodle-covered bathrobe, standing knee-deep in my flowered, a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters clenched in both hands. She was attacking the base of the mailbox, teeth gritted like a medieval executioner trying to decapitate a particularly stubborn knight. "Deborah," I shouted, throwing open the window. "What the hell are you doing?" She froze, shoulders rising, eyes twitching toward me. And then, without a word, she pivoted and ran, bolt cutters still in hand, leaving behind a trail of crushed tulips and a garden gnome missing its head. I stumbled downstairs, stepping into the yard to assess the damage. The mailbox stood strong, not a dent on it. But my poor garden bore the brunt of her fury. Tulips, snapdragons, and the remains of Mr. Gnomington lay scattered in the dirt like crime scene evidence. I picked up the gnome's head, shaking my head in disbelief. Deborah had lost whatever thin grip she had left on her sanity, and the whole neighborhood was about to witness the fallout. The HOA trial of the century. The emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, which had the architectural charm of a DMV waiting room and the tension of a courtroom drama. Residents packed the room, some out of curiosity, others out of a deep-seated desire to see Deborah finally get her comeuppance. Deborah arrived wearing what I can only describe as funeral attire for a dictator's widow: a black blouse, a black pencil skirt, and her ever-present clipboard clutched like a shield. The HOA president, a soft-spoken man named Bill who normally avoided conflict like it was a contagious disease, stood at the front of the room looking visibly uncomfortable. "We're here today to discuss the formal complaints against Ms. Deborah Rinslow," Bill said, his voice trembling like a man who knew he was about to anger a hornet's nest. "These complaints stem from a pattern of harassment, unauthorized enforcement of non-existent rules, and," he paused, glancing at me, "property damage." Deborah shot to her feet, her clipboard shaking with righteous indignation. "This is a witch hunt," she declared, her voice ringing through the room. "All I ever wanted was to maintain the high standards of this community. I am the only one who cares about the aesthetic integrity of Chestnut Drive." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman in the back muttered, "You fine me for having a pink flamingo in my garden." A man near the front raised his hand. "You called my daughter's lemonade stand a zoning violation." Another voice chimed in. "You reported my Christmas decorations for being too cheerful." Deborah's face twisted into a rictus grin, the smile of someone who's realizing, too late, that no one is on their side. "The evidence." Bill cleared his throat. "We've also received video evidence of trespassing and vandalism." I stood, pulling a USB drive from my pocket, and handed it to Bill. "This includes footage of Deborah attempting to destroy my legally compliant mailbox, multiple times." The room quieted as Bill inserted the USB into the ancient clubhouse laptop, which groaned in protest. The projector flickered to life, and there, on the big screen, was Deborah, caught in full night vision glory, swinging hammers, kicking steel, and monologuing to herself at 3 a.m. about the tyranny of non-standard mailboxes. The silence was deafening. Someone snorted. Then someone laughed. And within seconds, the entire room dissolved into helpless cackling. Even Bill, poor conflict-averse Bill, had to cover his mouth to keep from laughing. Deborah stood trembling, the clipboard slipping from her fingers and clattering to the floor. I was provoked. She stammered. This man, he set me up. He deliberately." "Deborah," Bill said, wiping his eyes, "it's a mailbox." That's when the vote was called, and it was unanimous. Deborah was officially voted out of the neighborhood. The final days of Deborah. The next morning, the for sale sign went up in her yard. Deborah herself was nowhere to be seen, though her curtains still twitched now and then, like a wounded animal hiding from a predator. The neighborhood held an impromptu block party that night, celebrating the end of her reign. Someone brought a karaoke machine. Lydia made her famous margaritas, and at the center of it all stood my mailbox, adorned with a string of fairy lights and a hand-painted banner that read, Long live the Mailbox. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. The farewell gesture. 2 days before she officially moved out, Deborah left something on my doorstep, a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside was her clipboard, the pages all torn out, the plastic scratched and dented. Taped to it was a note written in shaky handwriting. You won. I kept the clipboard, a trophy of sorts, and hung it in my garage, right next to my lawn tools. Epilogue. The legacy of the mailbox. Deborah may have left Chestnut Drive, but her legend lived on. The HOA passed a new bylaw. Residents could customize their mailboxes however they pleased, as long as they stayed within basic safety regulations. Chestnut Drive quickly became famous for its mailbox row, where each house displayed a unique personalized mailbox. From Lydia's castle mailbox to the house at the corner that built a replica of the Millennium Falcon around their mailbox post. Tourists even came to see it. As for my indestructible mailbox, it stood tall, the guardian of the street, the symbol of rebellion, and a permanent reminder that some battles are worth fighting. Because sometimes standing up to a petty tyrant doesn't just save your mailbox, it saves the whole damn neighborhood. The ghost of Deborah Rinslow. With Deborah officially gone, her house sitting eerily vacant, and the mailbox war seemingly over, you'd think Chestnut Drive would finally enjoy some well-deserved peace. For the first time in years, people hung Christmas lights without fear of passive-aggressive notes. Kids played in the street without getting scolded for their unauthorized sidewalk chalk. A man even put a pink flamingo in his yard, just because he could. But peace is fragile on Chestnut Drive, and Deborah's spirit lingered, even if her body was gone. It started subtly. A week after the moving trucks hauled her life away, my mailbox received a mysterious new decoration. Attached to the side with clear packing tape was a yellow sticky note, handwritten in ink so bold it was practically etched into the paper. You think you've won, but the game isn't over. I stood there, coffee in hand, staring at the note like it was a cryptic message in a bad thriller movie. Deborah was gone. Her car was gone. Her furniture was gone. But her pettiness, apparently, it had tenancy rights. I laughed, peeled off the note, and tossed it in the trash. I figured it was some leftover jab from her last day in the neighborhood, one final tantrum before her exile was complete. I was wrong. The return of the clipboard cult. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. Neighbors started receiving anonymous letters in their mailboxes, letters typed in a comically large font, warning of violations and aesthetic concerns. The letters had no signature, no official seal. But the wording? It had Deborah's fingerprints all over it. Lydia found one stuffed into her castle mailbox. It read, "Structures resembling historical fortifications may present an image of unnecessary hostility in a residential area. Bob, who lived across from me, got one too. Plastic flamingos exceed allowable whimsicality quotas." Even the elderly Johnsons, who had lived peacefully on the corner lot for 30 years, got a letter warning that their seasonal wreath violated the continuous neutral aesthetic principle, whatever the hell that was. It was Deborah's greatest hits, delivered from beyond the property line. Who was the phantom? There were only two options. Either Deborah was somehow orchestrating this from afar, or, more disturbingly, she had a follower. A disciple of clipboard tyranny, someone carrying the torch of HOA harassment in her absence. I set up a new camera, not just on my yard, but facing the street itself, hoping to catch whoever was sneaking around at night delivering these ghostly grievances. 3 nights later, I got my answer. At 2:38 a.m., The camera caught a figure shuffling up to Lydia's mailbox. The person was dressed in all black, poorly, I might add, with a reflective stripe running down their pants that made them easy to spot. The figure stuffed an envelope into the castle drawbridge slot, then scurried away like a raccoon who'd been caught stealing. I zoomed in on the footage. It wasn't Deborah. It was Maureen. The rise of the Rinslow sisterhood. I hadn't thought about Deborah's sister since the Great Shovel incident, but there she was, skulking through the neighborhood like a middle-aged ninja, delivering paper-based threats in the dead of night. The next morning, I invited Lydia and a few other neighbors over for coffee and a showing of the footage. We all gathered in my living room, eyes glued to the screen, as Maureen's blurry form lurched across our driveways, armed with a fanny pack full of petty complaints. Lydia was the first to speak. "That's just sad. She's like a ghost Karen," Bob added, shaking his head. "A Karen poltergeist. She's not even part of this HOA." Lydia said, "She doesn't live here." "She doesn't," I agreed. "But you know who does." They all looked at me, confused. The real estate agent handling Deborah's old house. The open house sabotage. Deborah's house sat empty, officially listed with a cheerful young real estate agent named Mindy. Mindy had no idea the land she was selling was haunted by generational pettiness, but she was about to find out. The first open house was a disaster. Not because of the house. No, the house was fine. It was the concerned community flyers that had mysteriously appeared overnight. Every potential buyer received a pamphlet warning them about rampant mailbox hostility, unresolved neighborhood conflicts, mandatory HOA conformity assessments, a dangerous influx of unapproved lawn ornaments. The flyers were, of course, unsigned, but the font, the phrasing, the complete lack of logic. It screamed Deborah. Only it wasn't her. It was Maureen, running Deborah's greatest hits tour like some kind of tribute band for suburban tyranny. Mindy, to her credit, saw right through it. She gathered the pamphlets, muttered something about crazy old neighbors, and threw them in the trash. But I knew Maureen wouldn't give up that easily. Trap and release. I had a plan. If Maureen wanted to play neighborhood phantom, I'd treat her like any other pest. I baited my mailbox with a fake response letter, carefully designed to provoke her into returning. The letter read, "Dear Concerned Party, thank you for your recent complaint. Unfortunately, your concerns have been deemed irrelevant under Article 7, Section 3 of the Chestnut Drive Freedom of Expression and Mailbox Personalization Act. Please note that all future complaints will be archived under Community Nuisances. Have a whimsical day." I printed it on bright pink paper, sealed it in an envelope, and left it partially sticking out of my mailbox. Easy bait. The very next night, the camera caught her. Maureen crept up, spotted the envelope, and snatched it out like she'd just found a treasure map. She opened it right there on my driveway, the pink paper practically glowing under the streetlights, and I could see her face twist into the same expression Deborah always wore when someone dared to disobey. She crumpled the letter and threw it at my mailbox. Then she stood there, shaking her fists at the sky, muttering something about desecrating neighborhood standards. The camera caught every glorious second. The public unmasking. The next day, at the HOA's regular meeting, I played the footage for the entire room. Everyone gasped, laughed, and muttered in disbelief. Maureen wasn't even a resident. She was a rogue outsider trying to enforce Deborah's imaginary rulebook from afar. The HOA voted to officially ban Maureen from Chestnut Drive. No visits, no deliveries, no passive-aggressive letters. She was the first person in neighborhood history to earn a formal trespass notice. The end of an era. That weekend, Deborah's house finally sold to a young couple with a golden retriever and a fondness for garden gnomes. The mailbox stood proudly at the end of the driveway, still adorned with its victory crown, a symbol of every petty battle we'd fought and won. As for Maureen, I like to think she's still out there somewhere, clutching her clipboard, wandering from neighborhood to neighborhood like a suburban ghost, looking for someone, anyone, to take her complaints seriously. But not here. Because on Chestnut Drive, we learned how to stand up to the clipboard tyranny. And we'll never forget the war we fought and won over a single indestructible mailbox. The death of the clipboard queen. Chestnut Drive settled into an unfamiliar but delightful silence after Maureen's public unmasking and banishment. For the first time since I'd moved in, neighbors actually stopped to chat at the mailbox cluster instead of performing the usual paranoid glance over the shoulder to check for clipboard surveillance. It was a new era, the post-Deborah age, as Lydia called it, and the residents of Chestnut Drive were basking in the glow of their newfound freedom. For a while, it seemed that the neighborhood had finally returned to normal. But there's always one final twist in any good story, and this story was no different. The mysterious delivery. It started with a package, a large battered cardboard box that appeared on my porch one Saturday morning. It had no return address, just a single word scrawled in Sharpie across the top. Memories. I stared at it for a full minute, torn between curiosity and a creeping suspicion that opening it might release a suburban curse. Eventually, curiosity won. I dragged the box inside, sliced it open, and found a collection of random items that could only have come from one place: Deborah's house. There was her old clipboard, cracked at the edges and missing the metal clip. There was a framed photo of Deborah standing next to a freshly planted rose bush, glaring at it like she was daring it to bloom incorrectly. There was even a bundle of handwritten complaints, bound together with twine like some sort of cursed manuscript. At the bottom of the box was a letter, scrawled in jagged handwriting. The letter from beyond the property line. To the homeowner at 429 Chestnut Drive. You may think you've won, but I want you to know that you haven't defeated me. Not really. This neighborhood was my masterpiece. Every rule, every regulation, every tiny victory over your kind. The careless, the whimsical, the disrespectful, they were all part of my legacy. You may have taken my house, my position, even my clipboard, but you'll never erase me. Because you can't kill an idea. Enjoy your mailbox, your gnomes, your ridiculous castle. One day, you'll see. When standards slip and the weeds grow, you'll miss me. Sincerely, Deborah Rinslow. P.S. I'm watching. I let out a laugh. A long, belly-shaking laugh that startled my dog out of his nap. This woman, even in exile, couldn't let it go. She was probably stewing in some cramped condo in a different town, lurking in online HOA forums, and plotting revenge scenarios that would never happen. I debated tossing the whole box in the trash. But then, inspiration struck. The community art installation. That afternoon, I gathered Lydia, Bob, and a few other neighbors, and we held a little art session in my garage. We took every single item from the box and incorporated it into a brand new mailbox memorial garden, right at the foot of my indestructible mailbox. Deborah's clipboard became a bird perch, zip-tied to a wooden post. Her photo was laminated and placed in a former neighborhood tyrant plaque. The bound complaint letters were arranged into a pathway stepping stone mosaic, sealed under clear resin. And at Lydia's suggestion, we built a tiny mailbox shrine, a 1:6 scale replica of my mailbox, and perched it on top of the whole thing, lit by a solar spotlight. It was tacky, it was glorious, and most importantly, it was ours. A celebration for the ages. We held a mailbox liberation barbecue that night, inviting the whole street. People showed up with lawn chairs, coolers, and stories about the petty reign of Deborah that spanned everything from garbage can placement citations to the time she tried to implement a mandatory birdbath policy to ensure aesthetic avian consistency, as she had put it. As the sun set, we held a mock ceremonial reading of her complaints, performed dramatically by Lydia and Bob in exaggerated British accents. By the time we got to the complaint about seasonally inappropriate wind chimes, I had tears in my eyes from laughing. The final event of the evening was a toast. We all raised our glasses to the mailbox that won the war, standing proud, shining under the porch light, unbent, unbroken, the last mailbox standing. The surprise postcard. A week after the celebration, I found a postcard tucked into my mailbox. No postage, no return address, just a single sentence written in blocky handwriting. One day, you'll wish I was still there. I had to hand it to her. Even banished, Deborah was committed to the bit. I showed the postcard to Lydia, who burst out laughing so hard she nearly choked on her lemonade. "She's out there somewhere, isn't she?" Lydia said, like a petty suburban Bigfoot. But the neighborhood had changed. What Deborah didn't understand, and never would, was that her reign of terror had backfired in the most spectacular way. The neighborhood wasn't just free of her tyranny. It had come together because of her. Neighbors who had never spoken before now shared drinks and swapped stories. The once quiet street had evolved into a quirky, creative, slightly rebellious community where no one feared a knock on the door or a citation for using the wrong shade of mulch. The mailboxes became symbols of resistance, of humor, of the absurdity we'd all survived together. A legend in steel and concrete. Years later, long after I moved away, I heard from Lydia. She sent me a photo of my old mailbox. Still standing, still indestructible, but now a protected historical landmark on Chestnut Drive. The new owners had kept it exactly as it was, a testament to the war that united a neighborhood. It even had an official plaque, courtesy of the HOA, which read, "In honor of the Great Mailbox War of Chestnut Drive." This structure stood tall against entitlement, pettiness, and misguided HOA tyranny. May it remind all who see it, some battles are worth fighting. I framed the photo and hung it in my new house, hundreds of miles away. A reminder that sometimes, the smallest things, even a mailbox, can spark the greatest revolutions. The end of the line. Deborah was never seen in our town again, but somewhere out there, I like to think there's a gated community trembling under her rule. Somewhere, a new resident is installing a garden gnome or painting their shutters the wrong shade of taupe, completely unaware that the clipboard queen is watching. As for me, I learned an important lesson. Never underestimate the power of a well-built mailbox or a neighborhood united by a common enemy. And that's the story of how a mailbox didn't just survive, it changed everything.